Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start in a couple of minutes. We've still got people coming in online. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here hosting our first ever Renewable Energy Services Hub Discovery webinar. My name is Mark Bowles. I'm the acting CEO of RecFit Renewables, Climate and Future Industries Tasmania. We're a business unit of the Department of State Growth. I would like to start by honouring and paying respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and here in Lutruwita, the Murawina people. I'll start with a couple of housekeeping matters. So we've actually got over 100 people here on this webinar so far, 102 to be exact, and there's another 25 that could come on later, so a great turnout. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be recording today's session and making it available for people to view afterwards. And after my presentation and the presentation of our guests here, we're going to have a Q&A session. Now, you can post your questions in two ways. So first of all, you can submit your questions now in writing through the chat or the Q&A function. And what we'll do is I will then go through those questions at the end and ask the delegates to respond to those. And we'll also at the very end ask for verbal questions as well. So we'll give you the opportunity to raise your hand electronically using the raise button at the top, and we'll work our way through the questions. So we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So we'll try and get through as many of those as we can, and those that we can't answer right away, we'll try and get to out of session. We'll also have a survey at the end. And so if you can spend some time to respond to the survey, that would be great. So today's session really has two purposes. So number one, it's to provide you, the audience, with the opportunity to hear a little bit about, from our external experts, the opportunities that are coming down the line for Tasmania in supporting the rollout of new renewables. And in the case of the proposed Bell Bay Services Hub, it's particularly servicing offshore wind opportunities, as well as the opportunities for servicing the onshore developments as well. And I think what's exciting about this opportunity is there are capabilities in Tasmania that not only reside in obviously the existing renewable energy sector, but other businesses in construction and services, research development, education and manufacturing that can service those new business opportunities as well. So our other speakers who you'll hear from a little bit later include Professor Stephen Cahoon from the Australian Maritime College, who'll talk about offshore wind supply chain opportunities. We've also got Bess Clark, the CEO of TasRex, who will provide an update on the offshore wind developments, as well as William Kulhoff from Core Marine, who will be talking about some of the logistics opportunities, particularly in the offshore wind sector. I'm just going to present my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? So the purpose of us engaging in this initiative comes out of an election commitment from the Tasmanian government, which was to commit $5 million in funding over 3 years to establish this renewable energy services hub in Bell Bay. This is one of a suite of complementary initiatives, all directed at achieving our TRET, the Tasmanian Renewable Energy Target, of doubling our renewable energy over time through the introduction of new wind, solar, and other capabilities in Tasmania to support both the growth in demand in Tasmania for electricity, for existing industry, households, and new industry, and the opportunities to support the energy transition nationally, which is quite significant. We'll hear more about that later. The scale is huge, including the opportunities offshore. We've got the Bass Strait proposed zone, which could support potentially 28 gigawatts of capacity, and Gippsland, which is also very well serviced from the Bell Bay Deepwater Port, with a potential capacity of 25 gigawatts. The Gippsland zone is well advanced, and the Bass Strait proposed zone is something that's is coming fairly soon. We're hoping there'll be a declaration. So our objectives is to establish this services hub in Bell Bay. Now, while the hub itself, we're conceiving as having a physical presence in Bell Bay, and obviously a key asset in Bell Bay is Tasport's port, and of course Tasports are already very conscious of the need to be supporting the growth in this industry, and are making plans for that. There's of course, the Bell Bay Advanced Manufacturing Zone already has a lot of great technical, world-leading expertise there that can support the growth in this industry. But it's really a hub and spoke model as well. We know that there's capability across multiple sectors across the state, the maritime sector based in the south of the state, a lot of renewable energy developments and other expertise in the northwest. But it recognises the fact that equipment will be coming in and coming out through Bell Bay, and it's an opportunity to really present Bell Bay and Tasmania as a centre of expertise and excellence to developers across Australia and across the world. So we're engaging with you now because we want this to be a truly industry-led proposition. This is not about government picking winners and saying that this is the way that it's got to be done. But we've certainly listened to industry. We've listened to those of you that have said, look, we think this is a really good idea. There's some of you that are already in this sector, and we're responding to that industry appetite to come up with a Team Tasmania approach to developing a really new, exciting collaborative sector. We've done this in the past with, for example, defence industries. 10 years ago, there was only a small handful of companies in Tasmania that supported the defence sector. That's now very substantial, and it underpins a lot of manufacturers. And we would see this as being an equal or greater opportunity for Tasmanian businesses, not only in manufacturing, but the services, construction, etc. as well. So this is really a start of the process to hear from you, to get your feedback, to hear from you about what role do you think government can play, and what are the key elements of this market where Tasmania can carve out a special, unique niche. So key dates and next steps, we've got today's survey, which is really important for us in designing this program. Again, we've got $5 million that we need to allocate strategically over the next 3 years. We want to get going quickly on this so that we stamp Tasmania and Bell Bay's place in this very competitive area. So we want to get moving. We'll have further industry workshops in October and November, a business-to-business event in Bell Bay, where we can interact face to face, not only with Tasmanian businesses, but we'll be inviting other developers down for that as well, and then presenting a strategic options paper to government early in 2025. Okay, so now we are also expecting the Minister for Energy and Renewables to join us to say a few words, but I think he's a little bit delayed at this stage. So what I might do is also just want to acknowledge all of our attendees. We're now up to 130 people here on this webinar, which is a fantastic result, and I think a really great reflection on the level of interest that we have in Tasmania from such a broad diversity of players. So online, we've got a number of players from the renewables industry. Government businesses are well represented. We've got Tas Networks, Hydro Tasmania, Tas Water, Aurora, Tas Ports. Obviously, from a government perspective, the government has announced that it sees its government businesses as being a key part in driving the strategic agenda in Tasmania and supporting jobs growth. Government's well represented here. Obviously, state government. We've got federal government attendees here, DQ and others, and local government as well. Great to see Shane Power online from Georgetown Council. Bell Bay Advanced Manufacturing Zones represented here. The TICTs here, hydrogen industry, Clean Energy Tasmania represented, Hyann. So a lot of great breadth. We've got construction industry players, as well as the University of Tasmania. So already we're off to a good start in terms of building a Team Tasmania approach. So without further ado, then what I'd like to do is just pass to Stephen. So I'd like to introduce Stephen Cahoon from the Australian Maritime College. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Slide up my presentation. So as Mark indicated, my presentation today is about the Australian offshore wind supply chain. So Tasmania is obviously part of that, but we are also looking much wider. I'd also want to acknowledge, pardon me, my colleagues, Associate Professor Peggy Chen, who's the co-lead along with me, and also our postdoc research fellow, Dr. Hongjun Fan. We also have about another 4 staff who's also working with us on this project. So I'll go through our larger project and then the work packages of which the supply chain is part, then work through the offshore wind life cycle, the supply chain that we've been developing through and gain a greater understanding of, give you an example of our modelling, and then some results from our industry engagement, talk about what our next steps are, and then one of the announcements from Blue Economy CRC that you may already be aware of in terms of the TAS demo that I'll come to. So firstly, in terms of the project, the larger project which we're part of has got a very long name, Identification of the Preconditions for the Development of the Offshore Wind Industry. This is led by Professor Marcus Hayward from the University of Tasmania. And in Understand the Preconditions, we've divided that up into 4 work packages. We have one that looks at the policy and regulations, and that particular team from University of Queensland is looking through the international best practices that then could be applied to the Australian context. Griffith University is looking after the social acceptability aspects to ensure that to find out what's the best ways to undertake the engagement with stakeholders in the local communities. And this is really to prevent any harm and respecting aspects such as place, the environment and the ecology. I'll come back to the one that I'm involved in work package 3. And then our final work package is one that actually pulls together the findings from each of the other work packages into a nice, into something that's been much more concise and focused, and from that develop the various strategic directions. We're now currently 1.5 years into the three-year project. So just digging down then into the supply chain work package, our objective is to see how we can assist to create a robust, resilient and sustainable supply chain here in Australia. We have 4 stages we're working through. We've already completed the first 2, which is the identification and understanding of what may be included in the supply chain and the life cycle. We've now just finished completing all the capability and challenges aspects of that. And the next stage that we're moving into is to validate some of our modelling. And I'll be showing you an example of that very soon. Here's some of the project partners, and these are just project partners that's in the work package 3. I think all up there might be about 60 different partners, but to see that Tasmanian Government, Tasports, range of universities and range of developers and other interested stakeholders are part of our partner group. Now, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, but as we were starting to develop the offshore wind life cycle and gain a better understanding of it, it was just how could we present this and the complexity of it and gain an understanding that might help us with the modelling. And we decided to do it in the circular fashion because then when we are speaking to various people, we can break it down into the various circles to help to simplify it a bit. But just as an example, you'll see right in the middle, we've been identifying what some of the targets are. Now, Victorian Government is one of the few that actually has their offshore wind targets. So we've got that in there, and then the rest of it was waiting until we can get confirmation from various governments, and also with the work that we're doing with the developers to understand what their expectations are. The life cycle, as you can see there in the second circle, is divided up into 6 different sections, going right the way through from the development and planning through to the decommissioning. And you'll see for each of those activities, we've asked some fairly basic questions. So I'm just going to show you 2 of those. So for example, in terms of the installation, we've been working through the various activities from the logistics, port involvement, types of vessels, understanding the sea conditions, because that has a big impact on how often throughout a year that installations can occur, and I'll come back to that point. Understanding construction periods, how long installations take for the various types of foundations, and trying to get a better understanding of the workforce that's going to be required. So that's in terms of installation. So obviously there's a lot of numbers that sit beyond this quite simple model. Just another example is the operations and maintenance, and you'll see there the types of estimates per gigawatt for the workforce. And this is where we start to find a number of challenges in terms of some views that the oil and gas sector will be shut down at some time, and all that workforce will magically reposition themselves across Australia and all have the ready transferable skills for the offshore wind. So that could be something that's problematic. And of course, the skills training that's going to be needed. And when you count into that the range of vessels that we'll need and the crew that would be required for that, there's just insufficient numbers of that in Australia, and there's a real need to start to train those coastal shipping seafarers. So that just gives you a bit of a snapshot on what we've developed in terms of finding out what the life cycle is, but how we've started to dig down into that. So as a result, we've been able to then develop the offshore wind supply chain, where we've been looking at the various raw materials that's required for each of the stages that flows onto the processed materials components and then the finished components. The circle that you see up towards the top, that's not the same diagram I showed you. This one here is a different one that digs deeper into the product life cycle. That the top half of it, the lighter colour, looks at all the different wind turbine components, the nacelles, the rotors, the towers, and the numbers around all of that. And the darker section is about the balance of plant components, so substations, turbine foundations, cables, and so forth. So all that data is helping us to do our modelling. So of course, once we've been able to identify where these may come from, and remembering that in Australia at the moment, we don't have any local content rules in terms of where these components may come from. So we've been having discussions with a wide number of people about what may be the capabilities, but also the capacities here in Australia to assist in developing some of the components that's required for the offshore wind industry. The next stage of the supply chain, of course, is the logistics, whether or not it's using trucks or rail or various vessels to get those products here in Australia to the right positions. And then all the installation and positioning, and realizing that the fixed bottom or floating approaches require different infrastructures and different areas of land within the ports. That then leads us to the commissioning, through the operations and maintenance, and then through to the decommissioning. Interesting with the decommissioning, in our early discussions with various stakeholders, the estimates were decommissioning would be after about 20 years. Now that's looking at estimates now around the 25 to 30 years, and maybe a couple of years after that. So that brings us to the modelling. So all those previous diagrams, all the data that sits underneath that we've been gathering from reports and from various interviews that we've been collecting, has enabled us to develop this tool. And this is a tool that we want to have something that's useful for industry and also for government, where various numbers can be plugged into it. So we've identified 3 different clusters around Australia, where their weather windows and their depths are very, very similar. So just as an example, in Western Australia, their weather window is only about 6 months a year where they can do installations. In the Bass Strait area, surprisingly, it's 12 months a year it can happen. We can then enter in the targets, what type of turbines and other foundations that we would have in place, and what sort of percentages. We've got estimates for the days of construction that would be required. You can see with the power turbines, we can vary that, because as the years progress, the turbines are certainly getting larger, and some of the developers have indicated they prefer the larger ones because of the efficiencies. We can also add into that the spacing that's required between the wind turbines, because that has implications for the amount of cabling that we need. The same with the number and positioning of the substations, the various vessels that would be required, and of course the workforce that would be required to man the installation, and also all of those vessels. That then brings us to the demand side, and with the demand side, there's crunch times coming. Now, in terms of vessels, components, cables. So, for example, we know from speaking to a developer that they've been informed that a major cable producer has indicated they won't be supplying to Australia because they already have contracts already in place. So part of what we're trying to understand is whereabouts we're going to source these components from, and at what point can developers actually put the contracts in place. So you'll see the whole range of different vessels there, and in fact in Australia at the moment there's either between 1 and 2 vessels that can actually install some of the largest wind turbines at the moment. And all of these are all subject to port capacities, the infrastructure they have or will need, and what sort of landing areas, etc., that they may have. And this is just the clusters, so it's quite an easy way of looking at the clusters, all with those similarities in terms of weather windows and depths. So in terms of our model, just a small case study just to give you some indications of where we're at the moment. Appropriate to pick the Bass Strait, since we're in Tasmania. So you'll see up the top the different type of targets. So some of these targets are based on what the Victorian government have indicated. Because in the Tas government we don't actually have a target as yet. We've used the developers or the proponents' targets to get those different types of estimates that you'll see flowing along the bottom and up the left-hand side. We've made estimates in terms of the size of the turbines that's going to be required, and from speaking to in all these interviews to a range of people, what sort of percentage of the different foundations will be in place. So, for example, and I should say that these numbers are indicative at the moment because our next stage is actually validating it. But we wanted just to provide some of the views, just so that you can understand whereabouts where we're wanting to get this model to. So for 2030, I should say that that when we first started this project, the views were that installations would begin in 2028. Now they seem to be being pushed out into 2030, maybe 2032. So all of this, of course, subject to change. But you'll see the number of wind turbines, the number of vessels, the amount of service vessels for the operations and crew transfer vessels, the length of these cables, and the sort of jobs that we may need, and have them trained up and available. Once we get to 2035, you can see those numbers are starting to ramp up. Never mind when we get up into the 2040s. So that there's a lot of components. Where are these components coming from? Can those be produced here in Australia, and of course here in Tasmania? So that just gives you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of our modelling. This will be refined further as we go through this next year and a half. But what this really started to show to us is this is a variation of the Swiss cheese model of risk. If everything goes well, we'll reach our targets. But in addition to these 5 factors, there's many, many more factors where if there's any sort of delay, it has a cascading effect where those targets may not then be reached, or may need quite a bit of time after that. So that's part of what our project is doing, trying to understand how realistic the current targets are. As a result of our industry engagement, we've had formal interviews with over 20 people from these different groups that you see on the left-hand side, and we've had numerous informal discussions as well, and we've still got our survey yet to do. But I've just put some boxes around some of those challenges, and these are just high level. There's a lot of detail that sits under these, but you can see concerns about the number of vessels being available, the workforce being available, and the training. Will there be local manufacturing? And some developers have said to us they'd prefer to have some local content because that will give less risk and greater security in the supply chain than having to rely on overseas markets. And of course, in terms of ports, we've seen the demise, or currently a demise anyway, of Hastings Port. So will that mean that we need multiple port strategies, or will there be single ports? And of course, targets and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty there in the market at the moment. So the next steps for us, we'll continue to refine our model. We'll get more figures on the supply and demand, and whereabouts some of the sourcing of the components and workforce will come from. We'll also from that then start to develop our strategies and make our model available for people to be able to use. So within the next 3, maybe 4 weeks, we'll be sending out our survey. So please, if you do see this survey, help us out in providing this with some validation of our model, because this is there to help stakeholders and industry, including industry and government. It won't take you long to complete, but it'll be very, very valuable for the next pages. And I just want to end with something from the Blue Economy CRC that you may or may not be aware of in terms of the TAS demo, which is the floating offshore demonstration that will be used. Now, it was initially being called TAS demo. That may change to be called the OS demo, as more assessment of potential locations are being looked at. And for example, in Tasmania, Bass Strait, Storm Bay, New South Wales, a couple of places there. So the project in the Blue Economy is still working through that. Interestingly, this demonstration is already in place in Spain. It's connected to the grid with the ability to provide energy for 2,500 homes. They'll be going through about 2 years of data collection, and that'll be one of the same purposes that it's used for here in Australia, to gather all the data about the installations, about the impact on the economy, and so forth. And just for interest, that base that you can see, that's about 30 metres by 64 metres in size. If you want further information, please have a look at the Blue Economy website. You'll see the link there, and you can get more more understanding of what they're doing. And that project's with SciTech. So Mark, thank you. I'll leave it there and await questions later on.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen. That was really insightful, and certainly I took a lot of interest in one of the charts that you showed, showing just the steep gradient of the growth between now and 2040, and of course that growth in offshore wind absolutely has to happen, regardless of all of the some of the risks that you identified. It has to happen because coal-fired power stations in Victoria being turned off, and they're desperately going to need to bring that new generation online for for energy security. So a lot of opportunities, and I think, as you said, the risks, the delivery risks, are opportunities for Tasmania as well in terms of local content to help these developers de-risk. So now to hear from one of the insiders of the renewables development industry, I'll hand over to Bess Clark at Tasrex.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I'll just bring up my presentation. Hopefully that is working for you all. I'm going to talk a bit about Tasrex, who are we, and then focus as a developer of offshore wind, I guess, representing the industry's view in terms of a little bit about the Bass Zone north of Tasmania, and also the joint work as an industry and with other stakeholders we need to do for a successful industry. So Tasrex is a Tasmanian clean energy business. It's founder-led. There's a group of current and former Tasmanians and friends and family almost who have seen Tassie's fantastic renewable energy history and see its potential to have a fantastic clean energy future, both in terms of generating clean energy, but also clean energy industries that the world will need in terms of cleaner fuels and the like to power a cleaner and decarbonising future. So one of our projects is the Northern Midland Solar Farm, which we're progressing at the moment, and we are also working to progress offshore wind bids in Bass Strait north of Tasmania. We are working with international offshore wind experts alongside our local expertise, and we are working with local suppliers, including Core Marine, who you will hear from shortly, and also with governments at local, state and Commonwealth levels to support a successful industry. And one of the things we want to do is build relationships with local communities and local suppliers and bring local context to support a successful Tasmanian business-backed bid in Bass Strait. So we've touched on it at a high level, but obviously a lot of work's been done to map Australia's offshore wind potential and consider how that relates to where there are customers and access to markets for offshore wind. And so the Blue Economy CRC did this work, and if you can see that Tassie is sitting in a very colourful zone in the heat map of really high offshore wind resource. You know, we sit in the roaring 40s. We've obviously seen some pretty extraordinary wind resource in Tassie over recent weeks. We also have the former land bridge between Tasmania and mainland Australia, which is a relatively shallow body of water. So we've got a really sweet spot where we've got opportunities for some relatively shallow water and really high quality offshore wind resource. And our opportunity is to develop that resource well and sustainably to help grow those Tasmanian industries based on a clean energy base, to decarbonise our existing industries and also support a decarbonising national electricity via interconnection with Basslink and Marinus Link into the future. In looking at the proposed Bass Strait area, So for those who are less familiar with the process, what the Commonwealth Government does is it does some sort of internal and stakeholder consultation, for example, across government departments and local governments, etc., at a high level, and says, okay, based on our constraints analysis, here's a zone we want to consult on and get broader feedback on. That then take on board that feedback, including feedback from First Nations communities, and then look at that feedback and declare a final zone. And the way the rules work is they can only make the zone they've consulted on smaller unless they get feedback that says, actually, we need to go back and reconsult on a bigger zone. So I think the expectation is that the Commonwealth Government will actually declare a zone that is somewhat smaller than what they have consulted on, because that's been what's happened in all other zones to date. So the Bass Zone is immediately south of part of the Gippsland Zone. It's connected on the top. It follows the lines. Someone's got a good ruler out and following the lines, which is obviously seeking to protect some of the environmental and cultural values between the Furneaux Group and mainland Australia. It's 20 k's at least offshore from the Tasmanian mainland, and also 20 k's off islands like Waterhouse Island near Bridport. And it's further than 20 k's off the Furneaux Group of islands. And then it's bounded on the west by the Spirit of Tasmania route. So that's sort of the broad consultation zone. And in terms of process, we've had it declared. That happened late last year. Submissions closed early this year. And we're expecting this calendar year that the final zone will be declared, and then feasibility licence applications will be opened. And applicants can apply for up to 2 licences, each of no more than 700 square kilometres. And experience to date shows that the Commonwealth may allow between 2 and 4 months to submit those licences on the final zone. There's a whole regulatory process about how you do that, and a whole suite of merit criteria that need to be addressed and met. And there's a process about if people have overlapping areas and are equally ranked of equal merit, then how those are resolved. So the feasibility applications are closed, licences are awarded, and all parties are told to go and try and work out any overlaps, and then licences in those overlaps are awarded. And I guess our expectation is that it's likely to be next calendar year that those licences are awarded in the Bass Zone. Having got a feasibility licence, you have 7 years to turn that into a commercial licence, which then allows you to build an offshore wind licence. But basically a feasibility licence gives you a patch of ocean that you can then all do all your necessary studies and work on. And then the commercial licence is really saying that you've got your approvals, you've got your investment case, you've got your supply chain sorted, you're ready to move towards a construction phase, which could take in the order of 2 to 3 years. And then, as we've heard earlier, then be in service for 25 to 30 years. And of course, like any major project, through achieving your approvals, you have to consider a whole range of factors. And I've just done a cut and paste of a DQ fact sheet, just signalling a whole range of the factors that need to be considered in getting the necessary permits and support for offshore wind. And obviously there's a range of information about that. I was going to talk, though, about a presentation Energise Renewables gave to the Offshore Wind Task Force that has been set up by the Clean Energy Council's leadership to support Australia getting a sustainable offshore wind industry off the ground. So I'm sharing this with their permission because I thought it was a really useful set of insights into how we remove roadblocks and enhance our opportunity in Australia and indeed Tasmania. So first of all, there are some pillars that are often led by governments and key infrastructure providers that support offshore wind. So you need strategy, you need policy, and you need frameworks to give effect to those. And what Energise Renewables has done is done a bit of a scorecard as to where are the different jurisdictions in Australia that have offshore wind proposals, where are they sitting against those factors. And I think if you do a quick scan of that scorecard, you can see that Victoria is absolutely leading the way, and that's very visible in the work they have done. They have set targets for offshore wind. They have established contracts for difference or equivalent models, so that they've said they will have auction processes for offshore wind to meet their targets. They have set up a government entity to lead the offshore wind planning and have been thinking through all the steps of what's needed for offshore wind across all the various dimensions of a successful industry, and are making progress in implementing those. And so I guess the assessment is most other states are lagging that, but the good thing is we can follow Victoria's lead and learn from what's worked in their jurisdiction and what we might be able to improve on. And they're working largely in a similar geography in terms of Bass Strait, and obviously some of their zones immediately adjacent to ours. In terms of thinking about Australia's industry, it is worth saying it has been an industry-led sector. It's really been, the opportunity has been brought forward largely by the Star of the South project and the initiative they showed in saying we have a fantastic offshore wind resource. Let's work together to get this moving, and then working with the Victorian and Commonwealth governments to lead that. But now, recognising it's such a regulated sector with so many dimensions and important community and economic dimensions, we need to get the regulatory frameworks coming alongside work supporting industry and supporting the opportunity. Because if we do a proactive body of work, we've actually got a huge opportunity to support our planet and to support our economy and to support our broader environment. In terms of key pillars of success, so Energise Renewables looked at what's worked around the world and when other jurisdictions have set up offshore wind industries, and they've basically said the first thing is that you need to get government, industry and stakeholders working alongside each other. All partners have to come together, which is why it's fantastic that we've got RecFit organising a session such as this today. And obviously supply chain and transmission are pretty critical in that regard, because around the world the experience has been if proponents of offshore wind just do their own transmission planning, the risk is there's a lack of coordination, can be a lack of social licence outcomes if everyone is building their own dedicated offshore connection point. So there's scope to do that well, and Victoria again has tasked VicGrid with looking at some connection hubs for offshore wind off Gippsland. Obviously, you have to be flexible. Every jurisdiction's different. There will be learnings along the way, but we need to start, and then we need to learn and adapt as we go. The other thing is that these are multi-billion-dollar investments, and they need patient capital. They are long projects that can take 10 years or so from start to finish, and then have ongoing operating costs that are quite material as well. So if we want offshore wind to be affordable for customers, we have to create the frameworks where investors will invest in these projects and banks will lend at reasonable rates, so that ultimately we can end up with an affordable energy resource for customers. So not losing sight of needing that bankability for the big capital investment in particular. And we also need to have a long-term view. I certainly know that many in Australia are still sceptical about the offshore wind industry, given it's more expensive than onshore renewables. However, I guess my observation is I think there will be plenty more onshore renewables developed, and there will come a time where social licence for those more of the wind farms onshore, and indeed more solar farms, and the transmission onshore that connects them will start to disappear. And so offshore wind becomes a really viable part of that longer term clean energy future, because the world and our own state and country needs far more renewables to support decarbonisation of a whole range of sectors, including transport. So we're going to need the energy, we need to have a long-term view, and we need to also, in that long-term planning, be thinking about what are the long lead time items that if we're not starting to plan for now, we won't get there in time. And so again, things like ports and transmission are critical in that regard. In terms of thinking about how you get confidence and certainty in developing one of these projects, Energize shared an example of Victoria versus current other jurisdictions at the moment, and saying that ultimately there's some main de-risking milestones. So Victoria had a policy direction paper. They've got a body that's released implementation statements about all the steps needed to support the industry. Site exclusivity, i.e. award of feasibility licences, has been achieved, so those proponents have more confidence now. I note that Victoria 25 gigawatts were awarded in Gippsland compared to the 9 gigawatt target for the state. So I think many industry think that was probably too many licences, because it's actually reduced that site exclusivity value, because there are so many sites and a sense that not all will proceed. And then I guess the next big step up in certainty is that auction process, where there's an underwrite framework that says we will ensure that you get a price that's no more than needed, but a price that underwrites the risk you take to develop your project. And then you work through your environment and planning and etc. approvals and all your other factors, all your campaigns and geophysic and geotechnical surveys and analysis and design and procurement and supply chain settling in to ultimately get to a financial close. And I guess that's the Victorian, illustrative trajectory, and so all the other jurisdictions are sort of tracking behind, and our opportunity is to put in place as a state some of these other steps to give confidence to investments for projects north of Tasmania. I'm not going to talk to this, there's a lot of words on this slide, but this is an example of the work that the Offshore Wind Task Force is looking at, and that's really trying to bring this coordinated approach to an offshore wind industry and make sure we have a successful industry. And there's three broad streams of work. One is around supply chain, the workforce we need, and the supporting infrastructure we need. One is around the ways we can maximise opportunities and remove barriers facing the industry, and that includes things like environment planning frameworks, financial support, data sharing, so that not everyone's studying the same stuff if it's the same species, for example, that affect multiple projects. Understanding impacts that are common, such as the impacts on flight paths and the like, and making sure that we're working with other critical sector plans, things like the Integrated System Plan for energy and Port Sector Plan for a multi-port plan for offshore wind. And then, always importantly, is making sure we are engaging with a range of stakeholders who have interests and views on the projects, learning from those, understanding perspectives, working together to address concerns and to realise opportunities, including with our First Nations communities who Sea Country is so important too. So in summary, we've got the opportunity for a new industry for Tasmania, and indeed for Bass Strait, and Tasmanian suppliers have an opportunity to support both the projects immediately north of Tasmania, but those in Gippsland and off Portland. This is a shot that DQ prepared, a visualisation of offshore wind turbines off Bridport, a place where I lived as a child and still go regularly. And, I see the opportunity for that community in its next iteration of growth and support of another industry off northeast Tasmania. I see the opportunities of strengthening our infrastructure, ports, transmission and broader community infrastructure, including housing and how we can leave a housing legacy as part of developing these renewables, growing our skilled employment base, attracting talented people, growing our own people, keep bringing people back and retaining young people, and that continued engagement and collaboration with our communities. So to me, it feels like we've got a world-class resource, we've got a skilled base to build from, and we've got a proud clean energy history. So I think we've got the opportunity to work together to unlock that next era of potential and prosperity for our state. And if you want to know more about TasREX, the information, and there's a shot from a beautiful farm at Bridport, where one day in the far horizon there'll be big offshore wind turbines helping to power our future and preserve our planet. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Bess. That was fascinating. And just a reminder for those of you online that you can start popping questions into the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those later. Bess, what I found really interesting was those slides around the pillars of success, how important collaboration is, and also those three elements of strategy, policy, and frameworks from government. And certainly our ambition is to turn some of those red dots to green dots for Tasmania very soon. And so I think we're off to a good start there. I think the other example of where Tasmanian business and government have come together to form a truly global hub is the Antarctic Gateway that we have, and that's something that government's played a role in, Tasports obviously, but industry as well through the Tasmanian Polar Network, and global Antarctic programs are coming through Tasmania now, not only because we're a good geographic location, but because we've got the skills and the logistics and the science to support their activities. So I believe we can do a similar and bigger thing for Bass Strait renewables. So at that point, I'll hand over now to William from Core Marine, who will start talking a little bit about some of the logistics required for the offshore wind sector.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just get mine up as well. And thanks, Bess and Stephen, for the good overview of the supply chain and industry in general. So I'll try and focus a bit more on the construction and logistics side, and highlight the kind of opportunities there for Tasmania coming up. Just quickly, Core Marine, we're a global company with about 60 people, focused in on the offshore wind and general offshore industry. So we've got a team of both wind engineers as well as offshore construction engineers, and a whole software development team. So we are both a consultant and also develop our own software tools, similar to the ones that Stephen was describing, but with a bit more focus on the technical development for these offshore wind sites and also logistics. So within Australia, we've been actively involved for the last 3 years or so within the Australian wind industry, helping developers bid for the feasibility licenses, showing them what their sites can look like, and feeding in the various inputs to their license applications. So yeah, jumping just to provide a bit of a picture of some of the global trends that are impacting the offshore wind industry and that we'll be feeling locally here too. There's massive growth globally going on within the offshore wind industry as it's really matured and start to become a preferable technology. I think it was Bess that was talking about that constraints around the onshore wind, and Europe in particular is probably a little bit further ahead with that, with being constrained with land onshore and the big push to go offshore wind. So the chart on the right there shows the installation per year in megawatts that is currently forecast, and you can see massive growth globally and not just by 1 or 2 times, but multiple times. So that kind of paints a bit of a picture of what the scale of the industry as both installation and following on to the operations and maintenance. So globally, this industry is going to be growing significantly for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And in terms of scale and support base required and supply chain behind it, will probably get to rival the oil and gas industry into the future. It's also important to know that image there doesn't show China. China's offshore wind industry is substantial and almost rivals that of the current installed capacity globally outside of China. Some of the other trends there is also in the size, so and scale of these offshore wind turbines. For reference, most of the onshore wind farms, the newer ones, are looking at those 6 to 8 megawatt turbines, but offshore, the projects in Gippsland are looking at more the 15 to 20 or even 23, 24 megawatt turbines. So much larger in scale, and there's still R&D going on for that to grow. So all of these large turbines and significant projects are really putting a squeeze on the supply chain, as some of Stephen's early findings alluded to. But also, on the flip side of that, presents great opportunity to try and bring some of that supply chain locally and build up industry, particularly as we transit away from other industries. So yeah, just to jump into what it looks like building this. So currently in Australia, we're in some of the early phases. So we're using some of the first surveys for geophys, and wave and wind monitoring are out at the moment in the Bass Strait for the Gippsland zone. So we're using quite a bit of smaller vessels for that type of work. That, as the project goes on, as you can see, there's multitudes of different vessels and infrastructure that will be going in and required support. So this creates great opportunity here in Tasmania, particularly around the ports, where all of these vessels and equipment all has to come in through from overseas, equipment to be loaded, people to go out to the various wind farms. So some of the opportunities there, just the ports, these early survey works. I'll touch on the secondary steel shortly, and cable ancillaries. The big one though is the ongoing support, because that's where the jobs are, and the longer term jobs. So we'll dive into that as well. Logistically, mentioned that those ports are the core. This slide probably highlights how integral they are to the development of the offshore wind. So there's 3 kind of different ports that we can talk about, and different types, and they all have different requirements. So the manufacturing and fabrication ports are where all the components are fabricated, and given the size of these, both all the components involved in offshore wind, most of them all have to be fabricated right adjacent to the port, either where they're going straight to site, or where they'll be transported to a closer port where they'll be going offshore. So, for instance, some of these wind turbine blades that we're looking at, they're up to 130 meters long. The towers will all come in different sections. Some of the foundations, they can be up to 2,000 tons just in a single foundation, and the offshore wind farm will need anywhere between 50 and 120 of those 2,000 ton foundations. And similarly with the cables, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of cable, which just isn't practical to be transported on land. So that'll all come from a factory that's adjacent to a port. The second opportunity there for the ports is bringing all that equipment in from your international transport vessels and staging it prior to installation vessels coming to site. So you'd like to keep your installation vessels, they're quite expensive, so you like to keep them busy, so and constantly engaged in work. So you'll bring all your components in both ahead of time to make sure that you can keep those vessels working continuously throughout your installation campaign, and you're not going to be waiting on another shipment of blades or towers from wherever they're being fabricated to come in. So those staging ports really have to be local, and certainly a great opportunity for Tasmania. Is you can't do them overseas. You need that that local staging site so that your vessels can come in, your installation vessels can come in and collect those components before going out into the field and installing them. And that, I guess, leads to once the site's installed, that ongoing work within the port as a maintenance and operation base, which will see both SOVs, which are larger service vessels, which can spend a few weeks or months in the field with people going to the various turbines and platforms, or smaller crew transfer vessels, and also support larger ships during other maintenance campaigns. So just a look at what some of these ports look like and a bit of a considerations for them and drivers. So access to larger vessels such as the jack-up turbine shown, wind turbine jack-up vessels shown on the top left there. They're quite large, can get up to about 250, 300 metres long, and require quite a deep draft as well. Component storage and laydown space is certainly key, as you need quite a bit in storage and constant vessels coming in to deliver these large components, and in addition, space to actually pre-assemble some of these components as they'll be delivered in smaller parts. Bottom left one there, distance to site, mentioned that's a key driver, and certainly a good opportunity for Tasmania, as Bell Bay is just as close to some of those eastern Gippsland projects as some of the Victorian ports. So there's certainly opportunity for Bell Bay to support some of those ports where we need the larger vessels to come into. And accessibility around that port as well for component handling for both ro-ro loads and lifted loads is essential, and that requires quite a different requirements on the port itself, like the nacelles that are shown there. They can get up to 1,000 tonnes for some of those 15 to 20 megawatt turbines we're talking about. So the bearing capacities on the ground are quite high for such a small unit. Just an overview of what the different style of ports can kind of look like. So on the top right there was that manufacturing one I talked about. The sheds shown there on the left there, that's a blade manufacturing facility. This shot is actually during the construction assembly, but that port is a permanent blade manufacturing facility outside of any projects going on, and they export blades from there around the world. But the laydown they require, again, is quite significant for just space to manufacture those blades before they get loaded onto the transport vessels. Construction port and staging port down on the left there, that's all the pre-assembly and importing of components before they get loaded onto the vessels for installation. And on the bottom right is a smaller port for operations and maintenance, but may see the vessels more around the 50 to 80 meters sitting in there, as long with requirements for staff, car parking, office space, and probably the more typical port facilities we have. Another couple from Europe showing a few different foundation types there. So on the top right, we've got the staging of jacket foundations, which are typically transported and installed vertically, as shown. So by the time you get 50 to 100 of those constructed and coming through the port as they're fabricated, can take up quite the space. So those jackets would be anywhere between 30 to 50, 60 meters tall, potentially up to 80, depending on the water depth. Port of Esbjerg, that's I think the largest offshore wind port in the world, with 450 hectares, which is a massive port, and can support the construction of multiple offshore wind projects at once. This is probably a bit of a case example of one of the opportunities for Tasmania, and to just provide a bit of context for scale. So I mentioned the main foundations themselves, can weigh up to 2,000 or 2,500 tons per wind turbine. If we're looking at all of those wind farms within the Gippsland area and Bass Strait areas, they could get up to 1,400 individual wind turbines. All of those wind turbines need not only the primary steel, the main bits that make up the jacket, but they also need all these auxiliary parts, which we're calling secondary steel. So the platforms, the ladders, the J tubes, all these small fabricated items are often seen as good opportunities for local fabrication, because they can be installed after the main fabrication, just prior to installation, and they're often not transported with all those bits and pieces, depending on how they're transported, often assembled just prior to being installed. So in terms of scale of that opportunity, as a rough number, 60 tons per wind turbine of secondary steel, with all the platforms, ladders, bits and pieces that go inside. That equates to about 86,000 tons of steel, which is 10 times our current fabrication capacity, just within the secondary steel. So see that those 14,000 wind turbines will be spread out over the next decade or two, but just within this one industry, there's the potential to take up Tasmania's annual fabrication capacity just within these projects. Mention O&M is probably one of the big ones ongoing. That's where you need the people and the time. It's not as one-off as the sugar hit of the construction campaign. We estimate around 70 million is required in direct spend. That's just on the vessels, personnel, and most of your equipment's already purchased, so it's just maintaining all that equipment. So that's largely spent on the turbine maintenance itself and balance of plant. So that includes all the maintenance on the subsea cables, the offshore substations, and the export cables. Inspections are a big one. Integrity and management of the integrity is going to be a core part of these, and identifying problems before they occur. And vessels each vessel that will be out there will need crews of between 10 and 20 people permanently, plus all the additional technicians and inspection crew that are on there for operating the various equipment. So big, and that's also per gigawatt, with some of those numbers that Bess highlighted for potential across Gippsland and Tasmania. That ends up to being quite a few hundreds of millions or into the billions per year just in operations and maintenance. The workforce opportunities, following on from that, so right in these early phases where we've got the planning and consenting going on, there'll be largely environmental assessments, engineering for the offshore, engineering for the onshore components of it. But as we push into the construction, certainly I think there's, I think it was about 500 or 600 people locally required per gigawatt, if not a few more, and then ongoing, obviously, all the support industries around that, with about 300 per gigawatt required ongoing, and that's across multiple different skill sets, all of which will require either retraining or repurposing those skills that they've acquired in other industries. Some more specific ones. So HV electrical is critical, as all of the electrics, basically, apart from the very small lighting and supplementary equipment on the turbines, is all HV. An extensive team of inspection technicians through mechanical, hydraulic, structural, and then specialists supporting them with some rope access, you can see on the bottom right there. Offshore pipeline survey techs, also cable techs flying the remote operated vehicle on the bottom left there, as well as all the marine crew that support them. I think that's all I had. I hope that gave a good snapshot of what's going to be required for these ports. But probably that key message is it will all be focused around the ports, and that's where I guess the benefit of setting up this industry hub within Bell Bay is certainly a good focus.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, William. And I think one of the things that's really outstanding about this sector is just the scale and the size of the turbines and the equipment for some of these future offshore wind farms are just going to really dwarf what most Tasmanians are used to sort of seeing with our local wind farms. They're just huge, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Both in terms of numbers and the size of the components, it's really an industry we haven't seen here in Australia at all compared to the onshore.
That's great. Okay, so we've now got 15 minutes for questions and answers. So I've seen in the Q&A box the questions are starting to come in, which is fantastic. So I'll go to the first one, which is Jeffrey Drucker from Countrywide has asked, how can the industry best engage and collaborate with the services hub? I suppose one part of that, the response to that is through RecFit now. So we're now see ourselves as a key facilitator of contact with other players in the sector, and we'll be building some of those networking opportunities in the future. But just interested in hearing from our other panelists. How would you suggest perhaps businesses that aren't as connected perhaps into the renewable sector, how do they start to get involved?
Yeah, I can jump in as probably someone that's already actively engaged in it. Saying across the different phases and kind of understanding, like as Bess described, and she had a great snapshot there of what some of these different phases will look like and when those activities are happening. So understanding who the developers are, because a lot of all the contracts and stuff do come out through some of the public portals for looking for suppliers. So engaging with that process and understanding what's going to be required when, because there is a significant development period before we're going to get to the actual construction, but being ready and having the right people and skill sets for that period will certainly helps everyone.
And Mark, could I just add to what William has said? I think part of it is just making sure that people know about your organisation and what its capabilities are, but also the capacities. What sort of time frame would it take to start to scale up? If there was any local content that they could provide. So I think, as William said, it is about awareness, but making others very aware of what you can do and maybe who else you can partner with.
That's probably what I was going to add to, is that I think one of the challenges is this is a huge industry, and it's how can some of the Tasmanian businesses partner together to create scale, and so that you're offering, because as a general principle, you want to deal, you want to procure from a tight group of people and have integrated contracts and things. So the more there's collaboration and bits that come together and make it easier to procure your service and work with you, because you've got partnerships and things across key elements. I think that's an opportunity for our state to understand that better, and how we can facilitate our local businesses to work together to offer solutions.
I think you're on mute there, Mark.
I knew I had to do that at least once today. So great question from Sarah Fitzgerald. What do we see as the well, perhaps a question for Stephen, but others might have thoughts as well. What are some of the key gaps in the supply chain for this sector that Tasmania, in particular, you think has the capability to service?
I think there are quite a few, and I think just going back to the comment about how large this industry really is, and figuring out from a Tasmanian's perspective what we can actually offer into that, and offer reasonably quickly if we need to scale up. But the workforce, what workforce can we start to train up now to get them ready and in place? That certainly is a prime gap in the supply chain. If we also consider amongst that the vessels, what sort of capacity have we got in Tasmania to start to build even if some of the smaller vessel, can we actually do that? How long would it take to scale up? And also with the fabrication. So we've got some great steel fabricators here in Tasmania. For them to scale up, it's probably a few hundred more staff that they would need, and it's also land. So I think another gap is actually that land availability that's close to the port. And there's one of the organisations that we spoke to reminded us that if we're looking at onshore wind, the onshore wind towers, they were limited to a diameter of about 4.3 or so meters diameter. That was because when you put them on a truck, then they can still fit under the overpasses to get them through to where they need to go. If we start looking at that from a perspective of offshore wind, we're up around about the 9 meter diameter. So that's really showing that we need to have something that's close to the port and is very, very, very easily accessible. And also, as this company reminded us, that if we're going to have bring in the sheets of steel that's necessary to fabricate for these towers, you're probably looking at about 40 truckloads of steel plate that needs to go backwards and forwards from the port to wherever the fabrication is occurring. So I think I'd say workforce, vessels, the train of the workforce, and also the fabrication and land in the ports.
Okay, great. A question we've got come in here from Tim Finnegan. We've got a live question, so we'll throw to Tim online. We'll turn your camera on now. Oh no, we've just lost him. I'll go to one of the written questions then from Duncan Eli. His question is, having spoken to some of the OEMs for wind turbines and towers, there appears to be a hesitation sometimes to relinquish meaningful activity to local service providers. And do we have any suggestions for how we can de-risk the provision of local content?
Yeah, I can try to jump into that, and
Okay.
I certainly probably agree with the sentiment that Duncan is providing. The fabrication, a lot of this equipment will be done overseas. Just the nature and in global context of the market in Australia is quite small, and so you're unlikely to see some of the OEMs for, say, a turbine setting up here. And so I'd probably say that our role will be to provide the service to them. They're not going to necessarily set up a whole offshore wind team here in Australia. They'll likely subcontract a lot of their requirements to local contractors and bring them in and upskill them so that the workforce is still local, even though the fabrication may be overseas.
Right, that's a really insightful position. So we've got Tim Finnegan back online, so we'll throw to you for your question.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. I've put my question in the written chat as well, so you can ignore that one now. It's the same question. I'm curious to know if the hub is considering an integration of research into activities, given the multi-mega billion-dollar industry this could grow into, and it will certainly have some unique jurisdictional and geographical challenges that may only be found in Tasmania. So what's the consideration for establishing a research activity through the hub, either via partnering with industry into a centre or some other means?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly we're conscious of the great R&D capability that we have here in Tasmania. Of course, the Australian Maritime College that's represented here, and the Blue Economy, CRC, and other parts of the University of Tasmania, and no doubt there are a lot of commercial service providers that can be part of that. Stephen, did you have any thoughts on building our R&D linkages?
Look, I think there's certainly opportunities, and there's something that we should do to tie in the research capacity with the industry needs, but it's more just getting the right sort of mechanism for that. So certainly the Blue Economy has been very progressive in doing that in the sort of funding that they've been able to provide, for example, into this offshore wind area, but that doesn't go on forever. And we just need to, with that training facility, if we had one, what would be its purpose, and what is it that we want him to benefit from for Tasmania and also Australia. So I think it is a wider view that it would need, but also making those recommendations on what sort of training that would be required and how those could be set up. So I think it's probably like a research and training type of centre that has a very active voice from industry embedded within it.
Yeah, and I also note that task force that Clean Energy Council is sort of leading the creation of across government, industry, and a range of stakeholders is also thinking about what is the the research that's needed to support the social license and permits and ongoing learnings, managing and mitigating impacts. So I think there is also that sort of research that, Tasmania needs to continue for its institutions, to build on the work done to date and grow that. And again, to the extent we build the reputation and depth of our own institutions, that only helps our local industries, by attracting and keeping people here.
Probably just one more thing to add to that one. The Australia has quite unique conditions everywhere around. We look around the coast. So, for instance, the Bass Strait zone, although we've had a lot of oil and gas there in the past, they're just been one-off platforms around. When we're starting to look at deploying hundreds of turbines across a single zone, that's going to come with its own challenges for the cables and the foundations that will need its own research. And I'm expecting that will play out on the east coast when we're looking at the floating wind farms off Hunter and Illawarra, where we haven't actually had any major offshore infrastructure out there. So understanding what those conditions are like and engineering properly will require some ground up research as well. So I think as the projects start to develop and we start to get into the design, those opportunities will emerge. And I think listening to the developers and trying to meet their challenges is going to be important.
Okay, great. We've also got a question here from Jen Newman, who's identified that, of course, ports and transmission are key success factors for any offshore wind success. And of course, we've got the role of the government businesses. I know that in particular, Tas Ports and Tas Networks are planning ahead for these opportunities. I did want to just give them an opportunity, if there's anyone online from any of the GBEs to provide any comments. If you want to raise your digital hand, we'll pick you up. So while we're waiting, so we do have just 1 minute left. So in that time, I did want to just thank you all for your attendance, particularly William, Stephen, and Bess for really well researched presentations. We certainly are planning to do a lot more workshops face to face across the regions and online. So we'll be writing to you and providing information on that. We'll also send out a link to the survey that we've got. So we've got a survey that we'll also post a link to the Q&A, and that's a really valuable way for you to tell us how you'd like RecFit to engage. What are the best ways of working with you, getting your ideas, and also supporting you to connect with other parts of industry as well. So we're right on 4:30. So I will wrap us up. I know we've had a really valuable 90 minutes, and thank you to all of you. Those of you that you've come along. I know there's a lot of people online who've got a lot of deep experience in this sector, and we really want to hear from you as well down the track. So thank you.
Thanks all.